Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. Weird show with the weird presenter talking about weird albums, yada yada yada. So today I once again have a rather strange album for you. This is a very interesting one, to be fair, which I found through the record label Attenuation Circuit, who we covered in our video for Music Not for Airports by Sally Nechko. So this album is one of a bunch of physical albums I bought from the record label when browsing through their merchandise, and it is one of my absolute favourite little live performances I've ever discovered. I feel like there's just something about this album that's really dreamlike and ethereal and just really absurd and Dadaist almost, I would say, but also just brimming with this untethered creativity, of course. One of those albums, that's just perfect for your mind to just wander far and wide with, if that makes any sense. So let's discuss it today. Today I present Counting Sheep Won't Cause You to Encounter a Dream of a Stray Dog, or Will It? By Martin Krejci, Sebastian Giussani and Keiko Uenishi. So of course, let's ask ourselves, who is Martin Krejci, Sebastian Giussani and Keiko Uenishi? And so to start with, both Krejci and Giussani are two experimental artists, both residing in South Germany, who have collaborated on many occasions over the years apparently, offering sound and visual performances that range from full-on digital noise mayhem and conceptual performance art pieces. And joining them for this very album today is one Keiko Uenishi, a sound artist, composer and event schemer from New York, based in Vienna, who has also released a couple of albums on the moniker of O Blatt. And so, another question to ask ourselves before we dive into it all: what is Counting Sheep Won't Cause You to Encounter a Dream of a Stray Dog, or Will It? Well, this is an album, of course, but it's a live collaborative album from the three musicians, released on the very strange Attenuation Circuit in this fantastic faux-vinyl package of sorts that also pops up as you open it, I have to say. I just love the physical release for this CD. I just think it's brilliant. Any case, this composition, live performance, which was performed live on June 4th, 2011 in what I think might be Munich, but I'm not 100% sure, as there's no real way to discern the fact, to be fair. In any case though, this performance is, a very strange, loose flowing, what I assume improvisation of sorts, through the gamut of electronic genres, all painting this mysterious and very blurred dreamscape that feels very much like, the very same state of mind, if that makes sense. Throughout this album, we explore lowercase to experimentalism to field recordings and, of course, drone. There's so many different drones that just completely paint the landscape with these thick swaths of colour against the dark nightly backdrop. It's all very cool and something I've been so obsessed with since discovering it last year at some point, I think once again around my birthday. It might have even been a year before, but it's very difficult to remember. Any case, rather excited to talk about this one, so let's dive into it, shall we? And so opening up, you're getting this bombardment of different sources, it feels, clicks and rising drones and this pinging detuned notes of electronic drones set against the backdrop of what I just call the rising hum of summertime, it feels. And the sounds themselves, it feels like we've been placed into somewhere really hot and humid, as we're slowly confronted with these unusual little electronics that occupy the entire scene. And I love the more menacing rumbles of drones that sort of fly in under the surface of it all, as clocks and beeps create this arrhythmic lowercase pattern of sorts. It becomes a rather slow shift, though, into the soundscape the composition offers, one that is slowly and subtly introducing new layers, into the scene, including the rushing of vehicles that fly past in such a blur. It feels like really slowly waking up and taking notice of all your surroundings, being unable to really place yourself anywhere tangible, of course, especially when certain sources become so much more intermittent, it feels. It's, I have to say, such an immediate hypnotizing opening in fairness that, as weird as it is, it does suggest to a lot of the strangeness of this sound world we're going to be inhabiting, for around a half hour or so. But also, it's, there's so much more than what we hear on the surface, if that makes sense. But what I love as well is when the whole composition, it just seems to open up entirely, following on from those rushes of those vehicles with this rising ambient drone that feels so much more joyous and playful than everything that's preceded it, essentially. And I love it because it has this element of charm to it, and it shifts the landscape into something so much more pleasant, even with being accompanied by those continuing bombardments of lowercase hums and drones. It's perhaps, maybe, arguably, like an indication of the kind of record this truly is. A composition that slowly evolves over time, guiding itself from movement to movement, into very different sceneries, it feels, but in a rather cohesive package, it feels. I think, without a doubt, one of the nicest parts of this whole composition, though, this whole performance, and it's one that feels oddly glorious, like just standing out, in the vast openness, just absorbing the warmth and the rays, Especially when you get these sort of chewier tones that mix themselves into those vibes with this bubbly presence, it feels. It's so oddly fun and incredibly delightful. And so a little tangent to go off on here, bear with me of course, but what I find interesting when it comes to experimental compositions like this, we end up being introduced to certain vibes and feelings through the music itself, only for the respective artists, to take almost a left turn entirely and transform the soundscape into something entirely different. And as a listener, I kind of like these things, because it's this kind of thing that really keeps you on your toes, as it makes it completely impossible to know where the composition will guide itself next. From the start we have this sort of ominous, grumpy drone, and then it turns into this glorious one, but where does it go next? Into this sort of bewildering, foggy sort of soundscape where you feel barely coherent almost, and it's an element in experimental works that I just find so exciting. You just wonder, where are we going to go next? Where are we finding ourselves next? And what are we going to feel next as well, if that makes sense? So to go back to the performance, it kind of guides itself into this incredibly spacey and almost zonked out landscape where it's almost like an overload of squelchy electronics caught in in amongst the very machines themselves, as odd ambient passages help to, guide it along, but it, also feels rather ominous, I would say. Weirdly enough though, I still feel like there's a pleasantness to this, it's all very confusing and bewildering, but it feels like just oddly pleasant in a weird way, but I feel like as well, the music at this point just has this effect where it feels like you're being pulled and stretched, forced to comprehend the bizarre nature of what we are hearing, as we're, powerless to actually even comprehend it, if that makes sense, and instead we just have to accept the fate of it all, essentially. It's once again an element I find so fun and rewarding in experimental music, as you end up discovering so many different facets about the composition, as well as watching your brain try to comprehend it, the very narrative of all. It's really fascinating. It should be said, there's something about this very performance. It just feels so dreamy and just beyond reality itself almost, especially in how it's always changing and shifting into these different musical movements. It feels kind of like when you are dreaming, when things just suddenly take their own left turn, dragging the preceding elements along with it and morphing it all into something else entirely. What I find very interesting, and a point I'm going to try my best to explain here, but in instances like these, especially on a composition like this, how it drags things around. It kind of drags around your emotions as well. Then we started off with fear, dragged it into pleasantness and stuff, dragged it into bewilderment and stuff. And when things like this happen, your emotions get dragged around, but they don't immediately dissipate. They kind of hang around a bit as we then try to comprehend the next movement, if that makes sense, even as it's trying to shift and change your feelings. And it creates this weird smorgasbord feeling, if that makes sense, you know? I kind of like moments like that, though, because you end up still feeling that, you know, sense of bewilderment or that sense of pleasantness, as it then guides up with something ominous, and you sort of feel at war with what you're listening to, if that makes any sense. It just fascinates me, you know, how the brain is trying to interpret everything all at once, you know, really taking into account how you feel as a listener to what it is you're experiencing, if that makes sense. And for me, one of the main dominating emotions I get from this entire composition is that sense of bewilderment. Confusion that you can't help but be fascinated by, as you end up becoming really curious as to both what it is you're hearing and what you're going to be hearing next. So to go back to the composition after that other weird tangent, of course, it all continues to shift, change, and what I like is when it leads itself into these rather unusual, almost minimalist lowercase moments where it's almost like a moment of respite in terms of what we're feeling, but it's not one that actually alleviates any of that confusion or even the fear that you might be feeling. It's the kind of thing it's all shifting and changing so much that all you can just do is just strap in for the ride, of course. And you just let the music have whatever effect it will have upon you personally based on how it makes you feel. And I genuinely get so fascinated by it all, you know, especially when those lowercase movements kind of, you know, devolve, you know, into these weird electronic moments that feel much more ominous, you know. You know, especially for me though, the most ominous moment, you know, comes kind of later in, where alongside those jarbled electronics, you know, you just have this form of chanting, it feels, this Gregorian chanting almost. And it creates such an unsettling vibe, as though our very dreams, which had these beautiful moments there, are slowly turning into existential nightmares. I have to say, genuinely such a fascinating little record to me, and it's one I find so much more rewarding each and every time I hear it, of course, like so many of the experimental albums we've been exploring on this channel. And to try explain it, it's one of those things where repeated listens just add a little bit more context and or understanding to the composition itself, you know, from hearing different elements or motifs that weren't so apparent to begin with, to even understanding your very emotions as the composition guides them along this very peculiar narrative. And it does leave me feeling really existential, you know, just lost in the recesses of my own brain, just as the music just takes effect, bombarding left, right and centre with these really peculiar electronic instances. And it's what I enjoy about experimental works though, especially ones like this, sourced from a live performance, you know, from the three musicians of course, you know. Like the fact that it's live just adds that element of brilliance to it, I feel. And how they've just created this constantly shifting landscape that pulls you along with its story, whilst also make you wonder as to what the particular details of it all are, like what were they playing, what were they doing. And so to mention the live aspect itself, you know, it's something that's cropped up a fair bit on albums I've wanted to cover on this show, you know, amongst many albums I simply haven't written about. Now, essentially, there's a plethora of these incredibly unusual live performances from experimental artists, and, you know, that are really fascinating compositions of sorts, or performances, essentially, and it's the live aspect that really fascinates me. And so for, Counting Sheep Won't Cause You to Encounter a Dream of a Stray Dog, or will it? Apparently all three musicians play laptops, which, you know, gives us a bit of context, but also we have no idea what they're doing on those laptops, do we? But, you know, in fair though, considering how fluid this entire composition is though, I genuinely wonder, you know, to be fair, if this is a case of different ideas being melded together through careful rehearsal, or if it's just the vibing up between musicians, you know, just accompanying each other through almost improvisational sound performances that, you know, if that makes sense. And I feel like, and this is an inference I'm making, I genuinely don't know for sure, but I feel like there is a sense of improvisation when it comes to a performance like this, you know? And it's that effortless nature of how it all comes together in that cohesive package that really astounds me, though. Such a weirdly fun journey to undertake, one that's demanding in times in terms of its, you know, dirgy experimentalism, but it's so genuinely rewarding with its sense of real-time occurrence that these sounds were all stuff that happened in of the moment, if that makes sense, for all of those people that, you know, just happened to be there to experience it. And so I have to say, there's a lot of different avenues, my head naturally wanders around as a result of hearing this kind of music, and they're suggested so much by the album cover of a barely lit country road of sorts. There's this presentation of a sort of abstract liminal space that you find yourself, in when dreaming, I find most of the time. That rushing of movement as you find yourself placed in unrecognizable places, that force a sense of nostalgia, even though you don't recognize it. The kind of idea of having been there before in some form of context. And maybe, a recollection of the briefest glimmer of a moment going past, from many, many years ago, or the abstract interpretation of the very surrounding themselves through dreamlike analysis. These are the things that make dreams so fascinating, and it's all very abstract and badly explained by me, but it's just that kind of existential wonder I get when I hear this album, of course, finding yourself in an unusual place and time, and slowly taking in all the surroundings as you're guided through this loosely evolving narrative that just is very free flowing into whatever direction it feels like, if that makes any sense, that pulls you along with it. And so before we close off, just to try to dissect it a little bit more though, I think a record like this, fascinates me for a number of different reasons. There's so many different emotions, feelings, and vibes that are all changing and shifting with the very music itself. But it's that sense of existentialism, of bewilderment, that keeps me coming back, specifically to this composition. I have to find, I have to say though, as I'm always looking for further context and understanding of it, simply by just listening to it, over and over and over. And as strange as it becomes in so many different places, it's also one that is fun and delightful, simply reveling in the eccentric nature of experimentalism, it feels, of electronic music and so many of its different facets. And the fact this composition seems to traverse such a wide range of genres, all fitting within the experimental electronic genre as well, is truly amazing to me, I say. Something that keeps you coming back time and time again, There's that kind of weird delight as, that something as strange as this was indeed performed live, as I tried to mention as well, But what I like as well, just to mention the live aspect again, it does feel like everyone was having a lot of fun playing this one, playing around with such unusual sounds, just making their sounds and just seeing their interactions in this live setting, and just having fun doing so. And I love it because they just traverse landscapes and monochromes, into lowercase sensibility and then into joyous ambience. A sense of bewilderment and wonder of seeing those sounds interact in such strange ways, creating these really unusual but really interesting vibes. And with that, I think we will just come to the end of our episode of Weird Music. I genuinely have no idea how this one's going to turn out, but heck, I have no idea with most of it anyway. It's a really strange show, isn't it? But anyway, I'm really glad to have talked about this particular live album today. It's genuinely one that has fascinated me so much since I first heard it, whenever it was I first discovered it. That is just a fun dive into the ever-shifting dream world, it feels. And of course, I love how it's a live performance as well. It kind of reminds me of that fascination I had with the album Three Pieces, which we dived into an earlier episode of Weird Music, also live performances that make you wonder, what's the context of people making sounds like this, if that makes sense? In any case, I definitely need to keep an eye out for more of these weird live performances, because there's so many of them, but so interesting I find, but really glad to have talked about this one today. In any case, I do hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Weird Music. There's links to the album, links to Attenuation Circuit all below, so go check it out. With that, I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye!